Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our wonderful event tonight, followed by our annual general meeting. My name's Richard Easton. I'm the CEO at the Neurological Foundation, and it's so lovely to see all of you in the room tonight. And also, we have maybe up to a couple of hundred people joining us online as well. So really excited about that. So it's my pleasure to introduce Sir Richard Faull, who's going to introduce our speakers tonight. So please welcome Sir Richard.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So it's wonderful to welcome you here tonight, and you're in for a bit of a treat actually. So concussion is suddenly over the last few years it's raised its profile. Everyone is worried about, if I get a knock on the head, what's going to happen and all the rest. So there's a lot of hype written out there. It's been a bit distorted. But it's critical, there's no question that it's not good to get hits on the head and get concussed. We study the brain, it's your most vital asset. So you got to look after it, but also you got to use it and you got to have fun with it. And tonight we have two wonderful speakers. Why are they wonderful? Well, they're wonderful because, I see different research fields in the brain developing. And what's critical about the development of exciting brain research is that to see young people coming in who are bright, who are innovative, and who think outside the square. That's the first ingredient. The second one, they've got to be enthusiastic and passionate. They've got to want to do it. Not only want to do it, but nothing's going to stop them. And that often comes from a personal interest. And if you've got a personal interest, in this case, concussion sport, both of our great speakers satisfy all these criteria. And they have had experiences in sport. Concussions, I dare say, they'll mention that to you. So you see, they've got a bit of a self-interest in this, but what we're going to get tonight is from Dr. Helen Murray and Dr. McGeown. We're going to get two sides of this interesting and fascinating and challenging story. On the one hand, you see, Helen's going to tell us about actually looking at the brain that's been gifted to do research. We have this wonderful brain bank, the Neurological Foundation Human Brain Bank, the most wonderful gift which is supported by the Neurological Foundation, which is at the core of all our research. And so Helen, you see, she's been overseas, she's worked with the experts in the United States, she's come back here. She plays ice hockey. As captain, I'm not sure if she's still captain, but of the women's ice hockey, been overseas, travelled, and she's brought back scientific skills to look at our human brain tissue from donors to try and unravel what is the pathology going on in the brain. And that's critical. What are the facts? And she's going to tell you about that, so I'm not going to, but it's a great story. It's a beginning story, and that's why getting your scientists in young and letting them grow, develop a team, is fantastic. But then Joss, on the other hand, well, he's also played lots of sports in North America. You may say something about that. He's got innovation to burn. He's working at Mātai, Gisborne, wonderful research institute. And he's looking at people, live people who are may be affected by concussion. He's doing studies on the live person. You can learn a lot from studying the dead brain, but you can learn a lot also essential from studying live people. So to have the spectrum of expertise and to have the enthusiasm and passion is just wonderful. And it's a new field. It's suddenly become aware. It's been around for years, of course, ever since we've had a brain, but suddenly it's got the attention of how much is too much in terms of concussion? What sort of packages are going to affect you? You know, what we must never do is take the risk out of life. I always say, you know, there's over 300 people killed every year on road traffic accidents. We don't stop the cars, we just make them safer. We make sure people protect themselves. And that is what we've got to do with this. And this is, you're going to hear from these two wonderful people tonight. And it's a pleasure to welcome you. Thank you, Neurological Foundation, for not only bringing us this lecture tonight, but you're actually funding both these people. And you know, the future is in the hands of people like Helen and Joss. And so I'll hand over to Helen now and she'll tell her story. Thank you.
Just get all set up. All right, kia ora koutou. Thank you for coming tonight, and thank you for everyone who's joining us online, and to the Neurological Foundation, thanks for bringing us all together. This is an exciting opportunity to show off some of the what we think are the most exciting things that we're finding in our research at the moment. And I'm a research fellow here at the University of Auckland in the Department of Anatomy and Medical Imaging, and I have the great pleasure and fortune to be able to look at the brains of people who have sadly passed away but wanted to leave a legacy in research. And on a day-to-day basis, I look at images like the one you're seeing up on the screen here, which is this incredible architecture of what actually makes up our brain and who we are. So as an anatomist, the first thing I want to do, if this works, hold on a second. Oh, I need to turn it on, that would work. Okay, there we go. Is talk to you about the most incredible organ that you have in your body is your brain. 86 billion neurons, all connected together in exactly the right way and situated in exactly the right places for you to be able to think, have memories, move. It's the most beautiful organ, and it's the most delicate organ. When you look down the microscope, which is what I get to do on a daily basis, and you see this really stunning architecture of what's actually happening, this little micro environment. It's like a factory that every little piece is playing a part in order for you to be able to do all of your daily activities. And this little image here, you can see if I just give you a pointer. These neurons here are in purple. They're the ones that are doing all the hard work, and they're perfectly connected together to be able to do what they need to do. They're supported by all these other little cells here in green called astrocytes, which reach out to blood vessels and get nutrients and give them to the brain cells. You've got these little red ones in here which clean up all the mess that gets left behind if anything happens. And it's just this delicate and stunning connection and microenvironment. And so when we have a head injury and something happens to it, you can see how disturbing any piece of this is going to have a really big effect on how we function in our daily lives. So to kind of orientate you to where my research sits in sort of our lifetime, and Josh and I are going to talk about slightly different scales in terms of time here. So if we think about head injuries, you know, they can happen throughout our life, and they can happen through a number of different ways. It could be through, you know, car accidents or falls. But Josh and I are really interested in sport because we're both athletes. I'm an ice hockey player. I've played ice hockey for the New Zealand Ice Ferns, the New Zealand women's team, for over 10 years. It's one of my other great passions in life. And so, you know, a lot of us start playing sport when we're very young. That is not a picture of me. I wish I was that cute. But we can start playing really, really young, and a lot of people will continue and play sport up into, you know, when they're in their middle age. That is a picture of me. Also cute, right? And this is where we end up getting a lot of our head injury exposures during these sort of earlier phases of our life. Now, for most people, this is going to continue on to, you know, a normal, happy, healthy life, and we might recover from those head injuries and everything will be fine. But we know that for some people, there's a risk that they're going to head off into a different trajectory, which is developing cognitive decline, because all of this accumulation of head injury exposure has damaged that really delicate balance of what's happening in your brain in order to function. And so we see this cognitive decline. That can progress into what we call dementia, which is this umbrella term, which talks about cognitive decline that's severe enough that it is affecting your daily life. that dementia can be caused, those symptoms can be caused by a number of different diseases that we know are increased risk of if you've had head injuries, including things like frontotemporal dementia, motor neuron disease, Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. And the one that I think is getting a lot of attention at the moment in the media and around the news is this chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. And so what I do is I look at the brains of people who have passed away in later life, and they've had this whole lifetime of exposures and things that have happened to them, and we're just looking at a snapshot right at the end to try and understand what's happened down the line. Now, I'm studying CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, because it's a unique situation where we think we know what the cause is, which is this head injury exposure. So it's an opportunity for us to see what's happening in the brains of someone who's had head injuries and try and understand how that's caused the type of neurodegeneration that can cause those brain cells to die and your function to be impaired. So this is what it looks like in the brain. What we've got here is a slice through. It's like if you took kind of a slice through your brain around the level of your ears and you were looking at it face on. And in CTE, what this is, it's a neuropathology diagnosis, which means it's a description of what's actually happening in the brain tissue, what's changing. And we specifically see it in people who have had repeated head impacts, and in particular, it's been widely reported in people who have played contact sports. And what we see is this accumulation of a protein called tau. It kind of forms these clumps deep in the folds of the brain, very specifically deep in these folds of the brain called sulci. And it forms even more specifically around blood vessels. And so in the earliest stages, what we see is one or two of these little pockets of that tau protein clumping up in those deep in the folds, and then it can progress so that you have more and more of these, what we call tau lesions deep in the folds. Now, if you zoom in on a microscope, this is what it looks like. So right in the middle here, this is our blood vessel. You can take my word for it. And around here, you see these dark brown clusters of, this is the tau protein, and it's forming inside the brain cells. And when that protein clumps up and forms in the brain cells, it stops those cells from being able to work properly, and eventually those cells will die. And we think that that's what's causing the degeneration that we see. Now, this can progress, and we can eventually see, again, you still see those lesions of all the tau protein in the depths of the cortical sulci, the folds, but you also start to see involvement of this area down the bottom of the brain called the hippocampus, which is the seat of our learning and memory. And this is usually associated with memory symptoms. That's what we normally see in Alzheimer's disease. So we know that the formation of this tau protein clumping deep in the folds of the cortex is related to the number and the force of impacts that someone's experienced. So this is actually really recent research which has shown that the larger number of higher impact forces that you've experienced is more likely to contribute to these later stages of changes that we see in the brain. But we don't know how much of this tau is related to the symptoms that someone might experience. To do that, we would need to follow people throughout their lifetime and see what sort of symptoms that they were experiencing, and then look at their brains after they've died. And that's a long study, and it just hasn't been done yet. So at the moment, we can only diagnose CTE in particular if we look at the brain after a person has passed away. That's not particularly helpful for people who are living. And diagnosis is really important. There was a story that I was told by a colleague from a brain bank overseas who told me a story about a man who had passed away, and before he passed away, he had become very aggressive, very impulsive, and his family had sort of left him because he was quite hard to be around, and it was just a really horrible situation, and he really sadly committed suicide. And after he had died, his family donated their brain to be studied, and they found that there was CTE pathology there, and the brother of this man who had passed away had said, "I wish I knew that that's what he was suffering from. Because if I had known this was a disease, I would have tried to do something about it." And so diagnosis is one of those things that it gives people an idea of what to expect, what's happening, gives you a context for what you're experiencing. But it has to be accurate. Because if we give a diagnosis of something that's as important or as life-changing as a dementia, progressive brain disease with no cure, that can be devastating if it's not right. And it has to be prompt, it has to be early, and it has to be done at a time where people can get access to the sorts of services that they might need if they're available. And then lastly, being able to diagnose CTE in living people is really important for us as scientists so we can actually develop treatments and find ways to make a difference. Because if you want to test a treatment, you need to have a group of people to try the treatment to see if it works. But if you don't know who has the disease, you don't know who to try the treatment on. So developing treatments or studying a disease, you need to be able to first identify those people, and that's why diagnosing a disease in living people is so important. So that's really the goal of my research, is to make discoveries that help us diagnose in living people. So I study the brains of people who have passed away to better understand the disease, to try and figure out what's happening in that disease that we might be able to detect with what we call a biomarker. So biomarkers are proteins or molecules that we can measure, say, with a blood test or with an MRI scan. Something that we can see in the brain, or something that we can maybe measure in the blood that tells us about what's happening in the brain. So it's something that we could check for in a living person and give us an indication of how their brain is tracking. So you might be able to look at all these markers or the outputs of your tests and say, look, this person looks like they're kind of heading towards this higher amount of brain damage, and we should start thinking about what we can do about that. And if you've ever known anyone with dementia, these diseases progress over time. And so being able to track the disease and see how it's changing over time is really important to, first of all, be able to understand the disease and give people an expectation of what might come next, but also so that we can measure whether any of the treatments that we give are helping slow that progression down. So by being able to measure what's happening in the brain, we'll be able to see if a treatment is working. We'll also be able to see whether someone's starting to progress from that low amount of damage to a moderate to a high. And if anyone in the room ever remembers this little guy with the fire danger sign, obviously we want to keep it green, right? We want people to be staying in that low brain, damage sort of area. We don't want people to have brain damage. So if we can tell early on that that's what's happening, then that's what we want to do. So that's why I study the brain tissue, to try and understand what's changing so that we can develop these biomarkers. So that's where this amazing Sports Brain Bank initiative comes in. We launched this initiative in, I think it was the end of 2019, and then we all know what happened in the next couple of years. So really this is a pretty new initiative where we're receiving brain tissue from donors who have had a significant history of contact sport. These are people who might have cognitive decline or dementia. They could also be people who are neurologically normal, have no changes. Because to be able to understand what's happening in those people who are heading down that cognitive decline trajectory, we need to understand what's happening to people who aren't. Like, how is it different? So we're studying both. This is part of a global initiative called the Concussion Legacy Foundation Global Brain Bank. So there's brain banks all around the world that are doing a similar thing, receiving tissue from people with contact sport history to better understand how head injuries cause dementia. Okay, so we work at the moment with collaborators from around the world. Obviously, we've only launched our own brain bank since 2019. Our Australian colleagues, they started this a little bit earlier than us, so they already have some donations, and we have been working with them to look at the tissue from the donors that they've received to start our studies while our brain bank is still up and running. And also with Professor Anne McKee at Boston University, she has a brain bank which is sort of the largest in the world, with about 1,000 brains of people who have been diagnosed with CTE. So this allows us to get the research going right away without having to sort of wait for donations. So what do we think is actually happening? Well, when we have a head impact, our brain is moving a lot. Even though you might think it's quite a small impact, our brain can actually move quite a lot inside of our skull. And those tau tangles that I was talking about before, those clusters of that tau protein in the folds, we know that they are forming in the areas that experience stress concentration. So this is kind of like one of those diagrams you see on the weather in the news, how when it gets really close together, the isobars are really close together, it's like really high winds. So where you see the lines getting close together is where the stress is concentrating. So around blood vessels, you see if the tissue is under force, the stress concentrates around that blood vessel. The same in the folds of the brain, all the stress is concentrating in those folds of the brain. And that's exactly where we see that tau protein clumping up, is in the areas around the blood vessels and in those areas deep in the folds of the brain down here. And I mean, this mirrors what we see in nature, this manhole cover, if there's a force through the concrete, the stress is concentrating around that area. And the same if you have sort of a dent in something, that's where all the stress and force is going to concentrate up through. So this guy here, Lee Goldstein, is a really, really clever scientist from Boston University, and he's done a lot of work on this, about how essentially the physics of the brain is defining the pathology that we see. And he uses this really great example of a candy bar and how you have those kind of ridges on the top of the candy bar. And if you apply force to those, what's happening is that the stress is concentrating in that fold, and that's helping you get into the candy bar easier. So it's a similar sort of thing that's happening, and that's why the tau is forming in that part of the brain. And so this is where it comes to our research. So we want to know what is actually happening when that stress is concentrated. How is the brain structure changing? And is there something in that process that we could then measure down the line to try and see what's happening in living people? So this all comes down to what we think, this all comes down to the blood-brain barrier. This is a really special part of the brain. It's a barrier that forms around our blood vessels in our brain to protect the brain from the circulating blood, because there's all sorts of things that can go around your blood that you don't want into your brain. Like if you have an infection, you don't want any of that getting into your brain. So this barrier can control what goes in and out of the brain. It lets nutrients into the brain, it lets waste come back out, but nothing else. We know that it's really susceptible to physical stress and injury. And we see this because in diseases like Alzheimer's disease, we see that this blood-brain barrier gets disrupted and you get leakage of blood into the brain tissue, and that causes the brain cells to die. So we think a similar sort of thing might be happening after head injury. So essentially this is demonstrating that. We have all these different components circulating through our blood. There might be immune cells, there could be like anything that's kind of in your bloodstream at the time, and it's usually very well separated from the rest of the brain. But if you have an injury, all of a sudden all of these things can get out into the brain, and that causes this localized inflammation. So inflammation is a response to try and mop up everything that's just leaked out and keep the brain cells nice and happy and preserve that very precious, delicate little microenvironment. And so the work that we're doing at the moment is currently done by my very talented PhD student, Chelsea. And she's really interested in this whole process of inflammation and what is actually happening. Those areas where we see all of that tau protein accumulating, do we also see a lot of inflammation? Because that would support what we think is happening in the brain, which is that the head injuries are damaging the blood-brain barrier, which is letting inflammation occur. And then she's also comparing this to Alzheimer's disease to see whether or not the type of inflammation we see in CTE is similar to what we see in Alzheimer's, because if it is, then that might help us understand that disease. And so to do this, we use a really, really exciting technology, which Richard sort of alluded to. We get to label the brain tissue with these fluorescent tags that show us different parts of the brain. And so usually the traditional way of doing this method is you can only look at sort of 3 to 4 different colored tags at a time. And that gives us images like the one you see on the screen here. All the purple cells here are all different types of brain cells, different neurons. And then we've got a couple of other ones we've been able to pull out, these little yellow ones and blue ones, and they do slightly different jobs. But while I was in America, we worked on a technique that would help us supersize this, because we thought, the brain is so complex. Being able to look at 3 or 4 different markers isn't telling us enough about what's really happening in the tissue. And if we wanted to look at all the different types of inflammation that we want to see, we'd have to label like 100 different pieces of brain tissue with 3 or 4 markers at a time in order to see what's happening. So what would be better is if we could label lots of different tags, 100 different tags, all at once, so we could see all the different types of brain cells all together. And so that's what I worked on in America, and I came back to New Zealand, and I was like, this is an incredible technology, we should do it here. And so we did, and now we can generate pictures that look a bit more like this. So it's the same sort of thing, but now you can see there's just so much more complexity. There's all these layers, there's different types of brain cells, and they're all doing different jobs. We need to understand how they're affected in this brain injury. So Chelsea uses this technology in her PhD project to look at inflammation. And these are some of the hot off the press, very, very recently, I think it was like 2 or 3 weeks ago, we really started looking at the results. It takes a little bit of time to generate these images, and this is sort of just a snapshot. We actually have about 40 or 50 different markers, but we're just going to show you a couple because there's not enough colors in the spectrum to show you everything at once. So what we see on the right is a person who had no cognitive changes in their brain function, and the blue that you see here is a protein that controls water getting in and out of your blood vessels. And in red, all these little squiggly, wormy-looking things are actually blood vessels in your brain. And you can see that that blue protein called aquaporin is quite equally dispersed throughout the tissue. In Alzheimer's disease, we start to see these pops of inflammation. So the yellow, the green, these are markers that tell us about inflammation in the brain. And the purple, which you can see this kind of band of purple that flies along the bottom here, this is the tau protein. So in Alzheimer's disease, the tau protein starts to accumulate all throughout the folds of the brain. We're deep in one of these folds right here. You can see it's just everywhere. So it's not like in CTE where you have those little pops around the blood vessels. It's all over the brain in Alzheimer's. And so what we see is just these pops of inflammation all over the place in Alzheimer's. It's very, very much an inflammatory environment. But this is what we see in CTE. So you can see that that protein that's involved in water, modulating the water, is not equally dispersed throughout the tissue. It's actually kind of concentrating in certain areas. We're not really sure why. Again, we only just found this out. But it's concentrating around this area that we call like the border between the grey matter, which is where all the brain cells live, and the white matter, which is where all their kind of tails go out to talk to other cells around the brain. We also see bursts of inflammation with this yellow and green here, specifically around the blood vessels. And again, this is a different case of CTE, and it's a very similar story. We see this accumulation of that inflammation around the blood vessels. And if we zoom in on this, so you can see it up close, this is kind of what it's looking like. So this is the blood vessel in the middle here, and purple is all of that clumpy tau protein. So it's all formed here around the blood vessel. And then we've got this burst of inflammation. So this is kind of fitting what we think is happening, is that the blood vessels are getting damaged, things are coming out into the brain, and then the brain's trying to deal with it and mop it up, and that could lead to somehow this tau protein forming. So we think that this is all about these little cells called astrocytes, because what they do is they latch onto the blood vessels and they talk to the blood vessels and they get the nutrients out to the neurons. And in a normal brain, they're happily doing that. But in inflammation, they get super angry and start to release all sorts of inflammatory molecules, which will recruit other inflammatory cells, and you just get this build-up of inflammation. And so possibly what's happening during a brain injury, and we don't know this, but this is me hypothesizing, is that you get this burst of inflammation, and then if you rest, maybe it will recover. And maybe if you don't, or you get lots of impacts, this damage is constant and it's going to accumulate. That's what we want to know. But we have a lot of other questions. When does this inflammation occur? We're looking at the snapshot at the end of the brain, at the end of a person's life. Is this inflammation occurring long before the tau tangles, or are the tau tangles before the inflammation? We don't yet know. And if the inflammation is coming first, how does that influence all of these tau tangles to form in the neurons? And is there something that we could do about that? And those are really exciting questions that we want to answer next. And I have another amazing, hopefully soon-to-be PhD student, we're just trying to find some funding for her, to start answering these questions. So Danica is currently doing a lot of this tissue labeling, and she wants to start looking in cells in a dish and try and stretch them and give them sort of a concussion in a dish sort of model, and then see what happens with their inflammatory status and see whether or not that influences this tau protein. So, in conclusion, before I pass over to Josh, the brain is this incredible, amazing organ, and it is beautiful, and it's delicate, and it is susceptible to injury, and we need to look after it. And I love this little cartoon because it's just amazing, but also somehow has these weird little quirks that we have to figure out. We know that head injury is a risk factor for this neurodegenerative pathology. We don't know how many people are going to head off down this pathway, but the fact that this is a risk factor that we can do something about means that it's worth figuring out what's happening and how it's working. Our research at the moment is finding that inflammation is a really important process that might be linking this head injury in neurodegeneration that we see. So we want to understand a bit more about that, and hopefully we might find that one of these inflammatory markers could be something that we could measure down the line in order to try and diagnose this in living people. And lastly, inflammation could be a biomarker that can help us detect and track brain damage in living people over their lifetime. And just before I pass to Josh, I just want to thank there are so many amazing people. Science is a team effort. I stand up here and present this, but what I've shown you today is really the work of two very incredible students over here. And my amazing mentors, Maurice and Richard, who have curated a brain bank that has allowed me to do this research. And of course, all the collaborators who are sending us tissues so that we can get started doing all this really interesting stuff. And of course, the Neurological Foundation, who is supporting me to have a job to do this. So thank you very much, I really appreciate it. As well as my other funders, who have the Gillespie Trust, who have funded Chelsea, and the HRC, the Health Research Council of New Zealand, which are funding the lab costs. So thank you so much, and I'll pass over to Josh.
Am I on? Yeah. All right, hopefully I can follow that because that was awesome. All right. Sweet. All right. As has already been said, thank you for everyone for coming. Thank you to the Neurological Foundation for making this happen and for giving me a job. That's awesome. So I'm here to talk about the other end of the spectrum of trying to tackle this problem that we call concussion. And I'm going to use that pun multiple times throughout this presentation. So concussions are brain injuries, which sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised the number of people I speak to who actually don't associate that their brain is injured when they've been concussed. The Latin root of the word concussion means to shake violently. So I actually find it more useful to think about concussion as a spectrum of injury that results from the brain being jostled around inside the skull. Throughout this talk, I'm going to try to use examples and analogies comparing concussion to other types of injuries people are more familiar with, because sometimes the brain can seem so complicated that it's unapproachable. So on one end of the spectrum, we've got repetitive head impacts. This easy example of this in sport would be heading in soccer, right? You go up, you redirect the ball. It doesn't cause any meaningful problem, but the brain is jostling around as a result. I think of these as subclinical concussions, right? It's not going to manifest into anything meaningful from that one impact, but if you accrue these impacts over time, it might start to manifest into something we need to deal with. So an example of that in other contexts could be carpal tunnel syndrome or a stress fracture if you've got suboptimal running gait. What most people are going to think of as concussion is what I call clinical concussion. So this is where there's going to be a blow to either directly or indirectly to the body that causes the brain to jostle around inside the skull, which may lead to that person losing consciousness, having amnesia, or reporting a whole range of symptoms that could include things like headache, fatigue, irritability, trouble sleeping, trouble remembering, and so on and so forth. So that's typically going to be called symptomatic concussion because people have symptoms that they're suffering through. As time goes on, most people will transition into asymptomatic concussion, where those things that are affecting their day-to-day life maybe have resolved, but the brain could still be a bit vulnerable from the jostling it took. And then there's going to be a group of people who will have persistent symptoms much further down the track after sustaining a concussion. And then finally, there's the far end of the spectrum, which Helen just talked about at length. That could be this link between everything on the left and cognitive decline further down the track. I think it's also useful to think about this spectrum in terms of time. So when we're thinking symptomatic, asymptomatic concussion, we're talking hours, days, weeks after the injury. When we move into persistent symptoms, now we're in the ballpark of months and years. Cognitive decline, years or decades after the actual exposure to brain trauma. So this is what most people think a concussion is. You know, there's one hit, boom, and it takes you from having a happy, healthy brain to a not so happy brain where now you're feeling some burden and your day-to-day life has been disrupted. So this could be like breaking your leg, right? Something happens, you fall, you twist it funny, boom, snap. Now you've got an injury. But it's probably more complicated, this, especially in the case of sport, where it might be our brain's quite resilient, where it can sustain some impacts over time, but then eventually we're going to get close to a danger zone, and then one more hit might actually be what tilts the scale into a place where now clinical symptoms are manifesting that need to be intervened with. So why do I care about this? So it's people generally like when I tell this story. So I was never great at sports, but I played a lot of them. I skied, played ice hockey, skateboarded, played American football, but my main sport that I really cared about was rugby, despite being from Canada. Because of this, I went on to do an undergrad in kinesiology, which doesn't really exist here, but it's kind of like sports science turned up a few notches. At that time, I was playing rugby for my university, and I had 2 concussions within 1 week in my 3rd year of university. I went on to have symptoms after these 2 injuries for almost 2 years. I saw doctors, physiotherapists, neuropsychologists, and basically the only advice I could get was anything that makes you feel worse, avoid it. But at that time, I was learning a lot about other injuries. When you roll your ankle, dislocate your shoulder, break a bone. It's all about progressive loading over time, building that thing back up so it can do its job again. And yet all the advice I was getting from my brain was just avoid everything. So that led to me getting frustrated and wanting to do a master's degree about how could we harness the power of exercise to help someone who was in my position heal their brain. At the same time, I had the great idea of starting a business where I worked in neurorehabilitation. So I was also kind of gaining this skill set of learning about research, but also starting to kind of see the disconnect between how a lot of research happens and how clinical practice actually works. In this period, I'm learning a lot more about concussion, what they are, what they're defined as, what the signs and symptoms are. And I start going back through my childhood and all the sports I played, and I realized, oh, actually, I'd had a whole bunch of these leading up to these 2 injuries that set me on this downward spiral. And so maybe it was the fact that none of those had been recognized or rehabilitated is what led to me having this unpleasant outcome that took a long time to dig myself out of. So after all that, I managed to convince some people to bring me over to New Zealand on a scholarship to do a PhD, where I was actually embedded in a specialist concussion clinic with some wonderful people in the room today. And my interest there shifted into being more proactive. What could we do better in the first 2 to 4 weeks after someone has a clinical concussion to prevent the likelihood of them going on and having these long enduring symptoms that I went through? Towards the end of my PhD, I got an amazing opportunity to join the team at Matai in Gisborne, where now my interest shifted into, okay, what's actually happening under the hood? What's happening biologically within the brain that is causing these symptoms to happen? And what changes as someone does or does not recover, so we can try to tease out those relationships. So across this journey, I've been the athlete, I've been the patient, I've been the clinician and the researcher. So it gives me kind of a unique experience to try to approach solving these questions. So taking a step back from concussion for a second, if you go see your doctor for something, usually what's gonna happen is they're gonna take a history, they're gonna ask a bunch of questions, do some clinical tests, and that might give them an answer about how to treat your condition. But in some cases, they might need some more objective information. And so there are lots of these tools out there, but some common ones are finger pricks for blood glucose to help manage diabetes, an X-ray at follow-up to see, hey, how's your bone healing? Can we take the cast off or should we leave it on? Or ECGs for heart conditions. But when we're talking about concussion, we don't have these objective tools to help guide this decision-making when we get into the gray areas of not quite being sure what's happening with someone. I could give you a bunch of stats about why this is, but I think it's more compelling if I tell a story that I observed from doing some of the research we've been working on the last few years. So I do work with adolescent rugby players, and I was at a training collecting data one day, and there was 2 boys both out with injury. They outwardly looked fine, but were both dealing with significant injuries. One had actually fractured one of his vertebrae in his lower back. He could still walk and move around and everything was all right, but had a significant back injury. The other one was out with a concussion, right? The one who was out with the back injury, everyone was saying, hey man, this is a serious injury. Don't rush back. You got a long career ahead of you. Take your time. The one with the concussion was getting heckled for being soft and wanting to miss a game against a tough opponent. And the only difference that I could see was that the boy with the broken back was able to show everyone else this is a CT, but he had an X-ray, was able to show everyone else, hey, this is my broken back. And intuitively, everyone saw the picture and said, all right, well, clearly you're not right. We need to wait for that to heal. With standard types of imaging for concussion, even someone who's heavily symptomatic, the typical CT, typical MRI scan won't show anything. So even though they're really struggling, the tools that we would typically use don't actually add much value in most cases. So that's what we're interested in trying to figure out at Matai, is we're studying the spectrum of concussion in sport, and we're mostly looking at repetitive head impacts and then these kind of clinical concussions as they merge from being symptomatic to asymptomatic. We've done this by partnering with the local high school and working with the first 15 and second 15 rugby teams there. We spent a lot of time focusing on community engagement, and we've got huge buy-in and partnership from the school, the players, the coaches, and the wider whānau of the group. Taking this approach, we've had over 70 athletes come through this study. This year, we had a 100% sign-up rate, so everybody wanted to be a part of it, and we had 90% retention at the end of the study. For context, in studies like this that have been done overseas in other sports, if you have about 60% retention, you're pretty happy. So the way we've approached engaging with these groups is clearly making the difference of keeping people feeling like they're a part and a partner in the research. And then because of the community we're in, it also gives us a great opportunity for equity from an ethnic point of view. So how is this designed? Well, to study repetitive head impacts, we use an MRI machine, and we bring the whole team of players in at the beginning of the season, the middle of the season, and the end of the season. Over that time, they get these custom mouth guards that have sensors in them that can track all the hits that their heads take over the course of the year. And we try to capture that data at every contact training in every game. It's not perfect, but you get a really good idea of kind of the differences across players. And the reason why the mouth guards are important is some players play every minute of every game and are involved in almost every tackle or running of the ball. And then you're going to have some players who sit on the bench or don't play very much. So we need to understand how individual differences in exposure might explain what we see on the pictures. Because we've got a decently large group of people playing a contact sport for months, we know, based on the literature, the concussions are going to happen, right? So if that does happen, we invite these boys back to come in for more scans, and we try to get one within the first 7 days of being diagnosed with a clinical concussion. And then we try to follow them up at least 1 or 2 more time points to try and see how are they recovering. How have the changes we see on imaging in the days or weeks after their injury correlate to the changes in the symptoms that they reported? All of these boys are getting world-class neuroimaging. To our knowledge, this is the most comprehensive advanced battery of MRI tests of any study in the world is happening in Gisborne. This is just a short list of some of the pictures that we're collecting, and I'll touch base on some of the ones that I'm going to share tonight in a few slides. So, quick anatomy lesson, just so we can orient ourselves. Some people way smarter than me have figured out that you can use the laws of physics to tease out different aspects of the brain, quantify and measure them, right? And so 2 parts that we're often interested in researching are white matter and gray matter. So easiest way that I think explain white matter is these are kind of the telephone wires within your brain. They're regions that carry signals and information from point A to point B. Whereas the gray matter, these are the thinking cells or the thinking regions. They're actually creating that stimulus that then is going to get transmitted around by the white matter. And so some of our early results, we've used a type of MRI called diffusion MRI, which looks at how water moves through the white matter. And we've specifically done an analysis looking at just the effect of repetitive head impacts over the course of a season. Does that change the white matter in these young rugby players? And so I stress here that none of these people had a diagnosed clinical concussion. It was just the repetitive head impacts. And we see on these slides that as we go from the left to the right, we are seeing that there's this kind of drift away from a control group of young athletes who don't play rugby. And the amount of change we saw from the beginning of the season to the end of the season, more change equaled more symptoms reported that are commonly associated with clinical concussions. So there's something going on there where even these subtle small hits can potentially pile up over a season, change the brain, but also lead to increased symptom reports. So what about gray matter? So this is just a really quick analysis I did just to have some illustrations for this presentation. So it's definitely not the whole story. But one thing we can measure in gray matter is actually brain function. And so we use something called functional MRI, which measures how blood flows throughout the brain and the patterns of blood flow. And then we're able to use that as a proxy for brain activation. So where blood goes, chances are that piece of brain just turned on or off. And we can take all of those patterns in blood flow and do a fancy analysis that creates these blobs that basically tells us which regions of the brain fire together in the form of networks. And in here, yellow means they're firing more strongly together, and orange means pretty strong, and then anything less than orange, I've just decided not to show on these images. And so taking the same approach of saying, and again, this is just a sub-analysis for the sake of this presentation, but randomly sampling about 8 controls, this is called the default mode network that we can see here. So this is a network within the brain that's basically our brain's idle state. Okay, so when you're not actively thinking about something or focused on a task, this is where your brain goes to reflect on the day, to be creative, or to just have a break. So if you've ever had a day where you're go, 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 locked in all day and you feel really exhausted, it's because you haven't really entered your default mode network much that day. And so randomly sampling 8 boys from early on in the season, we see that this network looks basically the same as the controls, and same at the end of the season. So what this is showing is there could be differences in how different parts of the brain respond to a season of rugby. We still need to do the rest of this analysis. There's about 20 networks we want to look at, and we need to run this on all of our participants. So this isn't the whole story, but I think it illustrates how we can look at different parts of the brain and how they might tell different stories. So last thing I want to show is 2 case studies, which are quite interesting. So these are what I'm going to show here is 2 case studies of boys who they came in, we scanned them at the beginning of the season, and they were uninjured. And then unfortunately, over the course of the year, they had a diagnosed clinical concussion, and then they came in for another scan. And so what this type of MRI does, which my boss Samantha Holdsworth invented when she was at Stanford, is it allows us to measure brain motion. So as the heart beats, the brain actually pumps, and there's kind of a distinct pattern of that pumping action. And so what these figures show is the yellow areas are where motion's happening, and the arrows are just pointing to that kind of line right in the middle of the brain where you can see lots of motion in an uninjured rugby player. This boy came in again 4 days after a diagnosed concussion, and we can see that that ridge of color that was in the first image has gone away. And so what we're interpreting this as is there's been a decrease in the motion of the brain after a clinically diagnosed concussion. And so that's just one case. So we took a look at another similar case, and we saw that in another boy who was scanned 2 days after his concussion, seeing a similar pattern. So there's still a lot more work to do to make sure that this is reproducible over time, but it's showing that, hey, this type of imaging might be useful for teasing out these injuries. An example of when this could be useful is sometimes you see an athlete take a hit and you think something's wrong, and they're like, no, I'm sweet. And you want to have something that you can show them that something's actually not right, to get them to then buy into the fact that they need to take some time off. So far, most of the analysis we've done is tried to answer the question, how much change might we see in the brain of these young rugby players over the course of a season, even if they haven't had a diagnosed concussion, just repetitive head impacts? And we've seen with some of our results, hey, there could be a change here over the course of a season. And this looks like, hey, this could be a problem that we need to figure out. But that's not the end of the story. To stop there would be irresponsible. If we identify a problem, the next step is, okay, so what do we do about it? What are the potential solutions here? And so the next logical question is, well, how much time would we need off after a season to allow these changes to recover before the next season starts? So let's just give this a chance to bounce back so that any changes we see aren't adding on top of each other season after season, which could be something that could contribute to people ending up in Helen's type of study. Right? So if we can identify ways to identify those solutions, that could make a big difference. So we're hopefully about to bring in the funding that will allow us to extend our current research to answer this question, where we'll follow these boys with the mouth guards and the scans over the course of the season, but then once the season ends, we'll continue to scan them into the off season. And then with that, and having the mouth guard data, we might be able to say, hey, the kid who actually doesn't play that much bounces back in 2 weeks. But the heavy hitter who plays a lot, maybe that takes 8 weeks. Now we can go and work with New Zealand Rugby, World Rugby, other sporting organizations to say, we need to protect 8 weeks uninterrupted each calendar year to just allow these brains and bodies to bounce back. And you can still do fitness and skills and whatever else you want, but hey, we just need to protect this time. And in sports like rugby and soccer, they're some of the only sports that don't really have a real off season. Ice hockey, American football, usually you're going to have 4, 5, 6 months off a year. Whereas in these other sports that are more popular in New Zealand, for whatever reason, they're just played almost all year long. And so we might be able to identify solutions to address anything that we're seeing that we don't like. So the results I showed you so far take a typical approach to science, which is, hey, we've got this complex problem. Let's break it into smaller chunks, understand each chunk, and by doing that, we'll understand the whole phenomenon. But there's a an area of science that I subscribe to that says, hey, with really complex things like the brain, maybe that's not how this works. We need to actually look at everything together to understand the true relationships. And so a quote I really like that I've put here is, the forest cannot be explained by studying the individual trees. You need to actually look at the whole to understand the phenomenon. And so that's what the work that the Neurological Foundation is funding me to do as a part of my fellowship, is how to look at the relationships shared across the images with each other. What comprehensive story do they all tell, rather than looking at the individual story of each type of image. And so this is a hypothetical figure I've put up, but this is a way that we might be able to use advanced statistical modeling to suck in all the inputs of all these fancy types of scans, and to then plot them out alongside how someone's doing from a clinical point of view. So this could be symptoms or neurocognitive tests or whatever we want. We could put it in a relatively easy to interpret, one-size-fits-all snapshot. So this could show us differences at a group level. What I'm really interested in is differences at the individual level. So if we get enough big enough control group, we can start to actually say, okay, for this person at this point in time, how are they doing versus all the controls we have? And then we can track that over time. So again, this is a hypothetical image, but this is where my work is going to go in the next 12 months. So let's say that this figure here is for one person who had a recent concussion and they're feeling awful. And then they go see clinicians who know what they're doing. They say, hey, we're going to get you on a rehab program. And then maybe they come back 3 or 4 weeks later. And we see, hey, your brain's healing. This is looking good. Your symptoms are improving. Not quite there yet. And then we could then continue the intervention, use the tools, and then say, hey, this brain looks good. You know, they're feeling good, the brain looks good, we feel confident they can return to work, to school, to sport, to military service, to whatever, and know that how they're feeling is matching how their brain's doing under the surface. So to use another bone analogy, when you break a bone, depending on how bad it is, at about 8 to 16 weeks, you might start to walk, run, jump. Right? You can get back to those things because your pain and your symptoms have gone down. The bone's fused enough where you can start to do those things. But for the bone to actually fully heal can take up to 12 months, right? So that's what I'm interested in figuring out here is where is healed enough, and then what is just the natural process of tissues healing within our body. So just to wrap up here, there's still a long, long way for this research to go. I think that's pretty obvious from both of our talks. But the landscape has really changed and continues to change rapidly. When the people who Helen's studying in her research, and even the experiences that I went through 10 years ago, was a completely different landscape. Even 10 years ago, concussions weren't a significant injury. They were almost never reported. People would just get knocked out on the field, play through it, finish the game, and be tapped on the back for being a tough guy. There was no stand downs to give the brain a chance to heal, and you just got this rest and do nothing approach to recovery. Now, knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs have shifted where more and more people say, hey, actually, this is something I should probably take seriously. Therefore, people report it, and so we can get more accurate numbers of how often is this happening and how are people recovering. We, for the most part, don't let people go back to the game on the same day. We take a play it safe model. There are minimum stand down times in a number of sports, which can be arbitrary, could be better, could be standardized, but it's definitely a move in the right direction. And then we know the huge benefits of active recovery. So the last thing to finish on here is with everything in life, as Richard said in the beginning, there's risks and benefits to any choice you make, right? And that's true for participation in sport. What we've talked about in our talks is the potential short-term or long-term risks of playing certain sports or activities on brain health. But that's not the whole picture, right? There's also massive social benefits to participating in sport. Teamwork, social skills, those are pretty obvious. Inclusion, one thing that is really good about a sport like rugby is it allows people with different body types to participate. There are certain sports where if you have a certain body type, you just can't play it. It's just not accessible to you. So from an inclusion point of view, it's getting people out there, being active, and getting all those benefits. From an opportunity point of view, I've got an interesting anecdote from the work I did this year where there was a team from South Auckland came down to Gisborne to play an exhibition match. And normally when teams travel to Gisborne, it's the Gisborne coach who says, thank you so much for making the trip to come all the way down here. But the coach from South Auckland was the one saying, thank you guys for letting us come. Our boys have never left South Auckland. This is the first time they've left the neighborhood they grew up in. They billeted and stayed in other people's homes, got to see different life, make new friends, do the whole thing, right? So that can't be undervalued. Positive outlet, sense of belonging. Some of the people who get attracted to sports like rugby, American football, ice hockey, they might not have the best things going on at home, and this gives them a place to go where they might feel a part of something. And then lastly, there's obviously huge physical benefits. The benefits of exercise are profound. And then some research has shown while playing a certain sport might increase your risk for neurodegenerative conditions, it might reduce your risk for dying of a heart attack, right? So there's a weighing of scales that we have to consider. And then, so our job as researchers in the medical community is maximize benefits. And we can do this by reducing risk wherever we can through good research, which could be preventative measures or it could be rehabilitation solutions. And then in places where we can't reduce risk, now we just need to communicate it accurately to the people who might be affected so they can make an independent decision, right? Some sports might not be for everyone, but they are for others, right? And people should have the autonomy to choose as long as they're given the right information. So with that, always have to acknowledge the funders because none of this would happen without you. So the Hugh Green Foundation, Neurological Foundation, HRC, MB, Auckland Bioengineering Institute, and an anonymous donor. And then I'm the one presenting today, but there's a whole huge team behind this, and every single person here contributed just as much to this as I have. And with that, thank you so much, and hopefully you've got some questions.
So we've got time for maybe 3 questions from the audience. If you can put your hand up and we will try and get one of the microphones to you. So just 3 questions. Who would like to go first? Over here, Helen.
I'm not so convinced by the risks and benefits analysis. I think you could get some of those benefits from doing something that wasn't a violent sport, like contact sports are. And I feel that it would be responsible for the medical profession to let people know more about the risks of contact sports, not just for the head, but for the body. A lot of people are paralysed because they play rugby. A lot of people really suffer.
A lot of things in there I can certainly agree with. When we look at the data about the incidence of all these types of injuries, it's actually like biking is the #1 cause for a lot of these big significant injuries, and horseback riding. So we want to often pin all the blame on contact sports, which there's some people who they're not for, absolutely. But people, I subscribe to the idea that people should have the right to choose if given the information, knowing what they're signing up for. And that's kind of where I try to focus my efforts, at least. But I do acknowledge a lot of the points that you made.
Another question? At the back.
Yeah, Mike asking Helen an inflammation question.
With town pig being and I can't remember last time I heard about it, I'm still a bit sketchy, but I think town pig will be sensitive enough to pick up the tau changes in concussions.
Yeah, so tau PET imaging. So what that is a type of MRI scan where you get a tracer that's put into your bloodstream and it binds onto that tau protein I was talking about, and then you can see it on an MRI scan, essentially. I've really oversimplified that, but I mean, that's the gist of it. A lot of those tracers which bind onto the tau, they have been designed mainly for Alzheimer's disease. They've been tested in Alzheimer's disease. There's been a few studies now that have looked at whether or not that tracer is picking up the same thing in CTE. So they basically, they put it into people who they thought might have CTE. They look at the scan, and then down the line, those people passed away, they look at the brain tissue. And what they found with that is that actually, where they saw the tau in the brain post-mortem was not where the tau tracer was binding. So in short, it seems like those sorts of tracers are working quite well for Alzheimer's, but they're not working quite well for CTE. And there is some really interesting work coming through with people who have looked at like the molecular structure of the tau protein, and it seems like it's different in CTE. So it's short answer, it's not working well right now. Yeah. Hopefully in the future.
Thank you so much. Thanks for both of your talks. They were really interesting. I've got a question for you, Helen. It's interesting about how much CT is being taught in relation to contact sport, but I was wondering, in terms of your tissue donations, do you also see CT pathology in maybe like donors who had early life abuse or domestic abuse?
So there's, in our brain bank that we have right here today, we don't have any cases with that kind of head injury history of domestic violence or young, violence in younger life. But there are studies overseas which have seen that pathology in victims of domestic violence, and it's certainly an area that we should look into. We call it the sports brain bank. It's actually more of a repetitive head injury brain bank, so there's no reason why we couldn't do that in the future, is look into that. But I mean, what we know is that it doesn't necessarily matter what the source of the head injuries have been. So we also see CT pathology in military veterans who have had sort of exposure to blasts and impacts and that kind of thing. So yeah, the source isn't necessarily the issue, which means that it's entirely likely we would see it in that population. Yeah.
Only thing I'd add to that is when you're trying to understand these problems, sometimes you've got to find a population where you can actually answer the question on. And at the moment, sports is maybe a little bit easier to build these types of things around, but the military angle, the domestic violence angle, the childhood trauma angle are all real questions. Those communities are also harder to reach. It's harder to get them involved with the research. So it's all part of a big ecosystem.
Cool. Again, we don't have time for more questions now, but I know once we've finished a little bit later this evening, Helen and Josh may be around to have a quick chat if you've got any specific questions. And for those of you that are online, if you have some questions, please do drop us an email and we'll work on trying to get you an answer to those as well. So if you could please just take a moment to join me in thanking both Sir Richard for his kind introduction to our speakers, and then to Helen and Josh for their most interesting presentations. Thank you both so very much.